I'm not a bad person. New tonight at 11, the man shamed around the world for shaving on a New Jersey transit train is now telling his side of the story. That man is Anthony Torres. The guy who recorded this video of him is apologizing.
The video has now been shared around the world.
Torres had just run out of eligible days at a Manhattan homeless shelter and was assaulted on the street.
Many who saw it were quick to shame the 56-year-old, not knowing he was homeless.
Millions have watched Torres on social media, many calling the 56-year-old names like a selfish slob.
I'm not a bad person, I'm telling you.
Try not to judge anybody, because you don't know, you really don't know their life.
We took to Facebook Live tonight, and viewers overwhelmingly told him not to feel sorry about anything.
But there's also emerging evidence that all this technology is really having an adverse effect on our mental health, on our ability to connect with each other, on our attention spans, and our focus. And even more worrisome is there's an effect on young people. And there's an emerging body of research that's exploring that we'll learn about this evening.
But what the web seems to be doing, and a lot of the proponents of the web seem to be completely comfortable with, it's pushing us all in the direction of skimming and scanning and multitasking, and it's not encouraging us or even giving us an opportunity to engage in more attentive ways of thinking. And so, to me, I think losing those abilities, we may end up finding that those are actually the most valuable ways of thinking that are available to us as human beings.
Joining me today is Nicholas Carr, author of The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains.
And unfortunately, another thing brain science tells us is that the process of paying attention, paying deep attention, activates a lot of our deepest thought processes, our long-term memory, the building of conceptual knowledge, critical thinking. All of those things hinge on our ability to pay attention. But along with that, what we lose is the ability to pay deep attention to one thing for a sustained period of time, to filter out distractions. And the ability to pay attention not only underpins kind of ways of thinking that are pretty obvious: contemplativeness, reflection, introspection, all those kind of solitary ways of thinking. But what we know from brain studies is that the ability to pay attention also is very important for our ability to build memories, to transfer information from our short-term memory to our long-term memory.
What really worries me is the disconnect between the beautiful story of the scriptures and the beautiful way that we've been created, and the disconnect between the two. Because it's like so illogical that we would voluntarily damage our brain, but that's what we do every time we choose wrong. It's so crazy that we would be judgmental or harsh or unkind or anything in the toxic zone when we realize that it's completely out of alignment with our natural nature. It's causing brain damage, it's damaging the world around us. And I think that's where the church has failed to make us be aware of that, to be aware of our responsibility. It's all illogical. We have to look at the human side. What did Jesus model? What does love look like? What does kindness really look like? That's for me what we should be focusing on and not blaming.
You can't see it, but you got me on the edge of my seat right now.
So just ignoring that, suppressing it, and saying, okay, I'm just going to put a Band-Aid on, and I'm just going to quote scripture over this thing, but I never deal with that. That doesn't go away. That's real. It's alive, it's living, it's dynamic, it's in your brain, it's physically built, it's connected to your mind. It has a spiritual element to it, and it has a physical element to it. It's dynamic, it's there. No amount of toxic speaking of scriptures, and that sounds like a paradox or a contradiction, because
what
what
makes it toxic? The fact that it avoids reflection?
Dealing with the issue. So you're not saying the scriptures, you're just using the scriptures to try and hide this, to suppress this. So you're taking the scriptures and putting a Band-Aid on that will fall off eventually, but you haven't dealt with it. Whereas this power in the scripture it's not the words, it is the behind, what does it mean? What does bring all thoughts into captivity? What does think on these things? What does choose life? What does it really mean? That's self-regulation, that's self-reflection, that's deep thinking. And then you see, okay, well, this is bad. And then you do something that I call freaking out in the love zone. You cry, you shout, you scream, you acknowledge it. David modeled that for us. Jesus modeled it for us.
I wonder what are the cliches that you hear that get on your nerves when you hear Christians just saying these phrases, or maybe even you've said some yourself that we really don't even understand what we're talking about, but it just sounds nice. Do you have some phrases like that?
I love what you've just said, and you've really now hit also that. This is just fantastic. You triggered me in the right way. Okay, so the Christianese, I deliberately don't talk Christianese. I will use scripture in a teaching sense, and if you notice when I use a scripture, I always link it back to the science, because I'm trying to make people think. Because 30 years ago, I remember driving to collect, it was 25 years ago, I remember driving to collect my eldest daughter, who was 2 years old, from her playgroup, and the one who's getting married. And I remember saying, why am I so obsessed with understanding the mind and the brain? Because it really is. I spend 2-3 hours a day researching. If you see me on my phone, I'm talking to my kids, or I'm reading research on the brain and the mindset. And I remember saying to God, why am I so obsessed? And the clearest answer, and I'm not trying to say I'm super spiritual, I heard some sounds from heaven, and I didn't hear any of that. I just knew this answer was, if you teach people to think, they will find God. So that's what, for me, that's been my life mission. Christianese has blocked people's ability to, renew the mind. It's just overused, bring all thoughts into captivity. Well, are you doing it? Don't say it if you're not going to do it. We need to realize the profound impact of when you say something, you need to make sure that you mean that. Otherwise, you have cognitive dissonance in your brain. Where you're
Break
saying
that down a little bit.
Okay, so you're saying what you know you should be saying because that's the culture. So Christianese is a culture. And it's a cultural trend, and this is how we speak, and this is what the preachers say. So you listen to the preachers and they all say the same thing, but they just have their own styles. And I'm talking in general now. Obviously each preacher is going to have a message that they deliver, but there's a certain language that is spoken in Christianese, and we're so used to hearing that we don't think about it. And that was my point that I was making earlier on. We don't really think about it. We recognize the familiar term, so we just repeat that, but then we don't actually absorb and make that part of our thinking and spend the 63 days, which is what it takes to build a long-term memory that will actually cause change. We're just saying those phrases over and over, but we don't really build them. They just kind of a surface thing that's hovering around. Well, I should be saying this because I'm in this cultural mindset. So it's actually toxic. It's a toxic tree. The minute you are aware of something, this is the key, and I can't stress it enough. The minute you're aware of something, it's weakened. Anything that's weakened is changeable. So we see from the brain science that a thought that you're aware of physically changes structure. You are slowly but surely popping these branches off, and you're not getting immersed and stuck in, guilt, shame, condemnation. I shouldn't do this. I must quote the scripture. I mustn't confess. That leads to the guilt, shame, and condemnation. The Christian world is producing more books on guilt, shame, and condemnation because they don't know how to handle guilt, shame, and condemnation. So first of all, when you say something, you first thought about it. It's not physically possible to utter words that you haven't first got some foundation from. So even now, I'm speaking from my years of experience in the field of brain research and the mind-brain connection. I'm not just speaking randomly about, I couldn't give you a lecture on actuarial science because I don't have any knowledge about it. So that's an extreme example to give you an understanding. So essentially, it starts with what you're thinking about. Your thinking has to have more attention paid to it. And that's why that every 10 seconds research is incredible.
Subtitle of this series, Triggered, is Taking Back Your Mind, which I think you would like.
Yeah.
In the age of anxiety.
Yeah, it's a very good time.
Am I right? Are we in the age of anxiety, or is this just business as usual?
No, we are. We have changed the way we are doing life. Our lifestyles have changed. The way we manage our mind has so dramatically changed in the last 50 years that we have actually we literally are gathering pieces like a puzzle, but we're not building our puzzles, and our brain can't handle it. So what we're doing as a society, we've changed the way we have used technology, and the way that all the advances have actually, we are making them work against us instead of for us. It's just basically, we need to start learning how to think again, how to balance, get our thinking cleaned up so that we can actually balance and get the right mindsets on. So it's a very good title. You will feel very anxious if your brain doesn't get a chance to rest. So it's the most natural thing in the world to think about our thinking, because we're actually doing it, but we've become very undisciplined in doing that. We've fallen into sort of this mode of numbing, and the church has contributed hugely to that.
How does our technology contribute to that?
And technology, hugely.
I've been wanting to ask you about this. I feel like I need to...
There's a whole chapter in this, my whole introduction in this new book. I talk about the impact of technology taking away our thinking mindset. And one of the most important things for survival as a human to deal with all the stuff we're talking about now is you have to get your thinking under control. And the scriptures say it very clearly, if your soul's not well, nothing else will be well. So, and we know that the heart, soul, whatever, there's many words that if you go back to the original Greek, but what they're referring to is your mind. You don't do without thinking. Every moment you're thinking, while I'm talking, you're always thinking. So it's not actually exhausting to think, because we're thinking, it's the decision that we need to make to how do we want to think, what do we want to do. That's the discipline, that's renewing of the mind. Society has contributed to that we're so connected that we're disconnected.
Right, people are undermined in their ability to engage with these kinds of high-level meaning-making when they're constantly reacting to things in the environment. And so the question for us has been, well, what does this mean for the development of children's brains? We know our brains are shaped by the forces of the environment and the cognitive demands we put on them, right? We know that there are systematic differences in brain structure and in brain function that are related to the affordances, right, of the world, the way in which you've been asked to think, and the tools that you have for doing that, like whether you know how to read, for example, is changing white matter pathway structures in the brain. And what we set out to try to understand is, are we potentially, by giving kids a world that's demanding their attention to this very high degree that we haven't had before, that's hijacking these very low-level systems for attention, for arousal that Larry and Adam both talked about, for dopamine release, right, for these kind of pleasure responses. If we're hijacking potentially the opportunities for the young brain to develop a balance between externally focused attention and the kind of internally focused attention that allows us to construct narratives about what it all means. And to make a long story really short, we and other labs are now finding really disturbing preliminary evidence that this is in fact potentially the case. That the more kids are engaged with this kind of immediate use of technology, and here it's not the tool that's at fault, it's the way in which you're using the tool, right? Engaging in in-depth conversations with someone on the other side of the world whom you couldn't meet with in person is a completely different use than just having little things pinging at you while you're thinking or while you're with a friend having a real conversation, right? But the more that kids and adolescents specifically are using these technologies in ways where the technology is driving them and stealing and hijacking their attention, as compared to them using it in a mindful, strategic way to gather information that you actually need to enrich your understanding of a situation, right? That kind of balance, moving back and forth between gathering mode that Adam talked about and reflection mode that I'm talking about, that balance, when it's perturbed, when it's shifted, seems to be reflected in the style of morality that kids have, in the way in which they interact with other people, the way in which they represent their own self, the kind of identity, the kind of sense of purpose, the kind of future possible self they describe. So kids who are doing this more are showing less a sort of skewed development in the relative network strength of external attention and reward processing versus internal attention and reflection. And what we're finding is that skew is related to values that are about adulthood, for example, that are much less psychological and much less deep and much more superficial and kind of appearance and action oriented. I want to have this, I want to do that, as compared to I want to be like this, I want to feel like that, I want to have these kind of relationships. And what we find is that, again, kids who have this more appearance and action oriented kind of reactivity to the world and to the social world, not just the online world, but the real world, right, are also showing this more fixed entity kind of appearance action oriented view of their own intelligence, which is potentially undermining their ability to work hard in school, for example. So there's a really dynamic kind of problem about that I find just really fascinating, and I think we really as a culture need to understand better, which is how we leverage these technologies in ways that we can smartly use them to gather the information we need in the service of something bigger, in the service of relationships that transcend the technological interface, in the service of information that informs our ability to build opinions and beliefs and values, which in turn inform our ability to reflect on and plan our own actions.